Good evening. I first have to confess that I am here in my own accord, despite the fact that I'm a commissioned officer in the Marine Corps, so lest the Marine Corps be offended by anything that I've said. These comments are my own and should be attributed to me alone. I am here, as I said, to talk about the Montford Point project. The Montford Point Marines are to the United States Marine Corps who the Tuskegee Airmen are to the Army Air Corps and now today the Air Force. The Montford Point Marines were the first Marines to come into the Marine Corps from 1941 to 1949. The first Marines came into the Marine Corps in 1942, although the executive order that authorized the recruitment and training of blacks into the military was signed June 25th of 1941. So regrettably, the Marine Corps was the last service to integrate. There were 20,000 Montford Point Marines that served from 1942 to 1949. They came from all walks of life. They came from all the hamlets and cities and towns all throughout America. And they came with a vision and a desire to not just serve our country in a time of war, but to with a special purpose, and that purpose was a movement to racially change and integrate America and to be free from the Jim Crow laws which had plagued our country and legally sanctioned segregation in the United States since 1895. So in 1942, the first of what later became 20,000 Montford Point Marines, and they were called Montford Point Marines because they were trained in a segregated camp outside of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which is now called Montford Point, but it's now called Camp Johnson. And they came to train and integrate the Marine Corps. But the sad truth and the regrettable truth is that the Marine Corps not just reluctantly accepted them and reluctantly tried to integrate the Marine Corps, but the Marine Corps, like the nation at the time, did everything that they could to try to subterfuge, to actually make racial integration fail. They, not just while in uniform, forced them to get off trains, for example, when they're going to and from war, get off the train so that prisoners of war could actually take their spots on trains. They were forced to go to the back of restaurants while in uniform, while heading to and from war to actually get food while they were being transported across the country to come to go to the Pacific. Of those 20,000 Montford Point Marines, my father was one of them. So today, I've been in the Marine Corps, as you heard, for 26 years. 70 years ago, my father was one of those 20,000 pioneers who came. And I wanted to tell my father's story in the context of this story to kind of give that firsthand account of this history and the reason why it's relevant socially and culturally today. My father grew up in Harlem, New York. He was a first-generation immigrant. He was the only child out of the 6 children in his family that was born in the United States. The rest of them were born in Jamaica, West Indies. So my uncle was actually a prized boxer and had won many bouts, and my grandfather was actually the head porter in a fancy Midtown Manhattan restaurant, hotel. And so together with that income, they were allowed to actually purchase a brownstone in Harlem. It was a 4-story brownstone, so they rented out apartments, and they were actually doing quite well. My father had gone to DeWitt Clinton High School, which was one of the charter high school that's a highly regarded school that was an integrated school. He was in his 2nd year of college at the City College of New York. And he came because his grandfather, my grandfather, directed him to come and told him that he had just read some articles and they had been discussing this within the Porters Union at that integration was now possible, and that this country had been very good, this country of the United States had been very good to them as immigrants, and he was going to give them his son, his youngest son. And he said that if you join this outfit called the Marine Corps, they'll teach you how to fight real good, and you can have a chance of coming back alive. It was an honor to serve your country in World War II. We were attacked in Pearl Harbor. Nearly 14% of all able-bodied men served, and those that did not serve in the war in one of the services served in another capacity in fighting the war effort, either in the factories or in their trade jobs directly supporting the war effort. So when he came south on that train, like so many others came south, it was the first time in his life he had really experienced integration. Segregation. And it was a traumatic experience for him, and it was one that is actually an important and a critical part in history, because as we now know through our racial integration history, that the military and this was essentially the test bed for the studies of racial integration and the mechanisms as to how we as a country were going to unite racially. And what they did was send these folks down there, okay? The conditions were very separate but unequal. They were trained actually quite well, but every person that trained them was white. So there was no officers at the time. In fact, at the time that my father joined the Marine Corps in 1943, a black man could not be an officer. They could not issue an order to a white person regardless of rank. They could never be in a unit where they outranked a white person. Even though there were white people in their units, as I said, as NCOs and officers leading them, they could never achieve such promotions. And that's the way it was. And that's the way they went to war. And that's the way my father's entire experience was during the war. The Montford Point Marines, there were nearly, as I said, nearly 20,000 of them. Of the 20,000, there were 13,000 that deployed overseas during the war. But what we did when we were forced to integrate blacks into the military is we took them, we trained them in what's called defense battalions, 51st Defense Battalion, 52nd Defense Battalion, and then we stuck them on either the southernmost atoll in the Marianas Islands, or we sent them to islands that were uninhabited, like Bonica and Kwajalein, and essentially did not allow them to get into the fight. Why is that historically significant? It's historically significant because at a critical point in time that we needed the manpower, all of our available resources to fight an enemy that had attacked our shores, for the simple reason of race, we did not allow these people to fight. And the reason that many blacks came from the North, where they were educated and they left college, and this movement was a movement not just to be free from the Jim Crow laws, but to actually prove that blacks were not inferior to whites. So there was a conscious movement that started in the churches and in the fraternities and sororities and historically black colleges, and there was a movement where there was a conscious effort to take the best and the brightest minds that we had in America at the time and be that test bed, be those folks that sacrificed so that integration would be successful. And the sad and the tragic truth is that at the same time, out of the 20,000 folks that came into the Marine Corps, over 3,000 volunteered initially. But in an effort to actually make racial integration fail, the War Department drafted blacks into the military. And what we're seeing now is that as I've had as a part of this project that I've been working on, I've had the opportunity to do the oral histories of in excess of 100 Montford Point Marines. And what we've learned is there's a very big difference in the quality of the persons that were drafted and the persons that had volunteered to come in. So we found that some of the folks that had been drafted had a 4th grade education, were married with 6 children. So if you look back in the War Department's rules as for who could be drafted and who couldn't be drafted, those persons were ineligible to be drafted, but they came in record numbers. So part of my project and what we've been able to do is to not just try to accurately, honestly, and openly tell this tragic point of our history, but what I uncovered after talking to in excess of 100 folks is the triumph over the tragedy. And the reason that I'm here today as the daughter of a Montford Point Marine is to tell that triumphant story, to be a source of courage, perseverance, and inspiration to people today. So I've chosen one story out of the 100, that in excess of 100, to tell you. And I'm going to tell you about Butler Martin. Butler Martin is 90 years old. He lives in Detroit, right outside Detroit, Michigan. He was was drafted into the Marine Corps and was in Guam. But the interesting thing about Butler Martin is that he brought a camera with him to the war. And in this, which was an unusual thing to have, that somebody actually had a camera in World War II because they were very expensive, and that he actually was able to keep it with him and secretly keep it with him for the entire nearly 3 years that he was deployed. And he took photos to capture this history that we're talking about. So he told me in great detail about being forced to, when they landed on an island, he didn't know which one, and he was forced to dig in where there had been dead Japanese bodies that had been languishing on the ground, and he was forced to dig in right next to dead bodies. And they were like, listen, there's no enemy attacking us right now. Why are you making us dig in right now? And he was very aggravated about that. So 70 years later, he's telling this story, and he's still shaking with anger about that, of being made to do that. Then he's telling us the stories about DDay and Saipan when the artillery shells are going over his head, and he's on an ammunition supply ship, because blacks were relegated to the jobs of the blacks that weren't put on these atolls, were actually put on ammunition supply ships and depot supply ships, and made to essentially be the strong source of labor that moves the ammunition and supplies from ship to shore. And he told about landing in Saipan and seeing ships in the flotilla as far as you can see, and then going in and out and making the runs to shore to deliver the ammunition and supplies and coming back. And he talked about how the shells were landing close, and at some points he was actually straddling the LST to jump off because he was literally sitting on crates of ammunition. He also told a great story of landing on D-Day Guam and what that was like and what it envisioned. So it's truly a walking piece of history. But the most amazing thing that he told was actually a very funny story and not a very good one for him. He told of a story of being on a patrol with Luther Woodard, who was, he and Luther Woodard were going through the woods, and they came across a pocket of Japanese. This was like 4 days after they had landed on Guam and had secured the island of Guam. There had been a pocket of Japanese that had been hiding out, and they came upon them on this two-man patrol. And he said that as soon as they were seen, Japanese came up, threw a grenade at him, and he said his world got very small. And when he saw the grenade and he saw it landing for him, he said he actually didn't react very well, and that he ran for cover. And it took him quite a while, it seemed. His whole world went in slow motion. It took quite a while for him to regain his consciousness. And when he did, Luther Woodard had already killed 5 Japanese and went on to kill 17 and won the Silver Star. And I knew that story because I had read all about that, because as a good historian, as I'm taking oral histories, I knew about that. And I couldn't believe that I actually met somebody that was on that patrol. But the interesting thing is, shortly after that patrol, which he has photos of, which these are some of the photos, he was caught with this camera. And so, per the rules, he was caught by a photographer's mate named A.F. Huger. And A.F. Huger caught him, and he was a photographer's mate, and so he had to take his camera and his film and photos from him. And so when he took those photos away, he said, but listen, I understand you have an affinity. They shared a bond. And he said, you understand photography. You seem to be doing really well at it. I will give you back your photos when I leave the island of Okinawa. And he did. And he gave him back those photos. And today, we have photos that don't not exist anywhere. Because part of the War Department's policy is that no one could photograph blacks in combat. No one could photograph them in action overseas because they did not want Americans to understand the contributions that blacks were making to the war front. So the inspirational story is the grace of a white man and so many others. There's a million great stories of this grace and this compassion that actually allowed us to have this hugely important piece of history that now allows us to tell this story. To tell this story of our contributions, the contributions of 20,000 folks, and the contributions of men just like my father. And the triumphant story is that now on November 23rd of last year, the President of the United States signed into law the Congressional Gold Medal that allows the Montford Point Marines to receive the highest award for significant achievement to be recognized 70 years later for their contributions that they made to the war effort. So the triumphant story of these 20,000 men can now be told in some of these photos, and in the fact that we now have a better understanding as a result of this project of what they did, what their contributions were. My father was just one of 20,000 guys, an ordinary guy who did an extraordinary thing at the time. And the grace and the compassion and the personal interface of that one story, but as well as hundreds and thousands of others, of the compassion of white America that actually said, this is not right, and gave them the dignity and respect that allowed them to be able to move forward. They came out in all but 1,500 of that 20,000 left the military after 1946 when the war ended, and then they went to college, got educated. Now their children are educated. And I stand here today as the testament of that legacy. Having the opportunity to get an education, not just through the military, but prior to the military, because of the economic stability that my father's service in the military gave him and allowed him. That legacy gets passed on through the opportunities that we all share today as a result of those courageous men who came, who set the standard for integration, who fought and persevered, and their courage and their commitment is what allows us to be able to meld together as a society today. That's the Montford Point story, and I appreciate having the opportunity to share it.